put my hand flat against a wall of ash last spring. Not a photograph of ash. Not a display case behind glass in some museum. An actual excavation trench northeast of the Dead Sea. Roughly 5 feet of solid black carbon and melted mud brick under my palm. And the person standing next to me said it like it was nothing at all. This layer is dated to the Middle Bronze Age. This is when the city died. I want to be honest with you from the very first sentence, because that's the only way any of what follows means anything. I wasn't looking for Sodom. I was fact-checking a single footnote in a book about ancient Near Eastern archaeology, and I expected to spend maybe an afternoon confirming it or dismissing it. That was 3 months ago. I am still not finished with what that afternoon turned into. Here's what nobody prepared me for. I thought Sodom was a story, a parable. The kind of thing you hand to 16-year-olds in a Catholic school classroom to make a point about sin, and then you move on to the next chapter before the bell rings. What I did not expect, what actually stopped me mid-sentence in a research library, is that the story the Bible itself tells about what happened in that city is not the story I repeated with total confidence for 12 years. Not close. There is one verse, a single verse, sitting quietly in the book of the prophet Ezekiel, where God, in the text's own words, names exactly what Sodom's sin was. And it is not the word I used every year I stood in front of that classroom. I need you to sit with that, because I sat with it a long time before I could say this next part out loud. For 12 years, I taught something about that city that the Bible's own prophet directly contradicts, not because nobody knew, because I am increasingly convinced somebody decided which verse got read from a pulpit on Sunday morning and which one quietly didn't. If I don't understand why that one verse got skipped, I don't think I actually understand this story at all. And worse, I don't think I understand what else got skipped along with it. Because once I saw that one prophet's own explanation had been quietly set aside in favor of a smaller, tidier lesson, I couldn't stop asking the same question about everything else I'd ever been handed without a footnote. What else did I teach with total confidence that was actually just the version somebody found easiest to teach? Before I go any further, if this is your first time here, this channel exists for exactly this feeling. The moment you realize the version of a story you were handed was smaller than the version that was actually written down. If that's the kind of digging you want more of, hit subscribe. It's the only way YouTube tells me this kind of research is worth funding, and it's what lets me keep standing in trenches like that one for you. I'm Nathan. For 12 years, I taught world history at a Catholic school in Indiana, and Sodom came up every single year, usually in the same 40-minute block. Usually taught the exact same way. A city so wicked that God burned it off the map. One sin, one word. Say the word, watch the class get uncomfortable, move on to Abraham bargaining God down from 50 righteous men to 10, and close the chapter feeling like you'd covered it responsibly. That's the version I taught with total confidence. I never once, in 12 years, opened a Talmud. I never once cross-referenced Ezekiel. I certainly never mentioned an active excavation site that archaeologists are still arguing about right now. In the present tense, this year, I taught a morality tale and called it history, and I did it in good faith, because that's genuinely all I had been given to teach. Here's what I know now that I didn't know then. Let's build the version I was taught properly first, because you need to feel how solid it seemed before I show you the crack running straight through it. Genesis tells us 2 visitors arrive at Sodom's gate, and Lot, Abraham's nephew, living inside the city, takes them in against, we're told, the custom of the place. That night, the text says, the men of the city surround the house and demand Lot send the visitors out. Lot refuses, the visitors strike the mob blind, and the next morning fire and sulfur fall from the sky, and the whole plain is leveled. That's the sequence. 4 verses of buildup, 1 act of violence at the door, catastrophic judgment by morning. I taught those 4 verses as if they were the entire file, as if the case was closed the moment the fire hit the ground. But the Bible doesn't actually stop talking about Sodom in Genesis. It keeps talking about it. Prophets invoke the city as a byword for centuries afterward. Isaiah does it, Jeremiah does it, Zephaniah does it, and almost every single time they use it as shorthand for a very specific list of failures. Not the one I was taught, a different one. Here's the sentence that stopped me cold. Ezekiel, writing centuries after the destruction, has God speak directly about what actually happened in that city, and God does not describe the scene at Lot's door at all. God says this: "This was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had pride, excess of food, and prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and needy." Pride, gluttony, comfortable indifference to human need at the gates of a wealthy city. That is the canonical, in-text, God's own voice explanation for why Sodom burned. Not once in 12 years of teaching that story did I read that verse out loud to a single student. Think about that for a second. This isn't a scholar's reinterpretation or some modern reading trying to soften an uncomfortable text. This is the Bible defining its own most notorious catastrophe in a different book, centuries later, using language that has almost nothing to do with the lesson I was handed. Arrogance, excess, a city so comfortable it let people starve at its own gates. That's the sin Ezekiel names. That's the sin the text itself puts front and center. So why wasn't that the verse on the wall of my classroom? Why was it never once the verse I heard from a pulpit? I don't think it's an accident that the passage naming institutionalized cruelty toward the poor got quietly filed away, while the 4 verses describing a mob at a door became the entire inherited memory of an entire city. Now, I want to stop and be fair here, because the first thing a careful reader should ask is whether I'm doing exactly what I'm accusing the pulpit of doing, cherry-picking the one verse that's comfortable for me and ignoring the rest of the canon. So let's look at the rest of the canon honestly. In the New Testament, the Book of Jude, in its 7th verse, describes Sodom and the surrounding cities as an example of those who indulged in sexual immorality and pursued unnatural desire. That verse exists. I'm not going to pretend it doesn't, and I'm not going to pretend it isn't sitting in the same Bible as Ezekiel. Here's what I had to sit with once I put both verses on the table side by side. This isn't a case of the modern reading against the ancient one, some new theory built to dodge an uncomfortable text. Ezekiel was written roughly 6 centuries before Christ. Jude was written generations after him. The pride and cruelty reading isn't the recent one. It's the older one, by hundreds of years, sitting quietly upstream of the verse everyone actually quotes. And the Talmud's entire portrait of a city that criminalized charity, the bed, the courts, all of it, was compiled centuries before a single line of Christian doctrine on this subject existed at all. So, which verse is right? Honestly? And I mean this, not as a dodge, but as the actual answer I've landed on. I think the canon itself is holding a tension it never fully resolved. Ezekiel names arrogance and cruelty to the poor. Jude names something else. Both are in the same book. Both were written by people who believed they were describing the same catastrophe. I don't think my job, or anyone's, is to throw one of them out to make the story simpler. I think the honest move is to hold both, and to notice that for most of my life, only one of them ever got read out loud to me. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because Ezekiel and Jude together weren't even the part that ended up keeping me up at night. They were just the first crack. The part that actually broke something open came from somewhere I genuinely never expected to look. I remember, specifically, one October, grading a stack of quizzes where I'd asked my sophomores to name the sin of Sodom in one word. Every single answer, across 4 different class sections, said some version of the same thing. Not one student wrote pride. Not one wrote cruelty to the poor. Not one wrote anything close to a city that legislated indifference to the hungry at its own gates. I remember feeling, at the time, a small flush of pride of my own. Look how consistent the lesson landed. Look how clearly the point came across. I filed the quizzes, moved to the next unit, and thought nothing more of it for years. I understand now that I wasn't measuring how well I'd taught the Bible. I was measuring how well I'd taught a filtered version of it. A version filtered so many times by so many people before me that by the time it reached a classroom in Evansville, Indiana, the filtering itself had become invisible. My students weren't wrong. They gave back exactly what I gave them. I just hadn't asked myself, until a research trip 3 months ago, who decided what I'd be handed to give them in the first place. Here's where I have to back up, because Ezekiel alone didn't explain the scale of what I was starting to sense underneath this story. If the Bible's own prophet defines the sin as institutionalized cruelty toward the poor, where does that tradition go next? Does anyone actually build on it? Or does it just sit there, one overlooked verse, and end? It doesn't end. It gets bigger. Centuries of Jewish scholarship, collected in the Babylonian Talmud in a tractate called Sanhedrin, took Ezekiel's one-line indictment and turned it into an entire portrait of a city that had made cruelty into policy, not a mob that got violent one bad night. A legal system built over generations, engineered to make generosity itself a punishable offense. The rabbis describe what's come to be called the bed of Sodom. A guest arriving in the city would be offered a bed for the night, and if the traveler was too short for it, the hosts would stretch his limbs on a rack until he fit. If he was too tall, they would cut him down to size. Every visitor was made to match the bed exactly, whatever it cost his body to get there. I don't think I need to explain why that detail landed on me the way it did. It's not a story about hospitality gone wrong. It's a description of a system built to punish anyone who didn't already fit. And it gets worse, because the rabbis go further than a single, grotesque piece of furniture. They describe formal courts in Sodom, actual judicial proceedings that had made it a punishable offense to feed a beggar. Not merely frowned upon, criminalized. A city, according to this tradition, that had built law around the specific goal of making sure no poor stranger could survive within its walls on the kindness of a stranger. I sat with that for longer than I want to admit, because here's the thing that actually unsettled me. This isn't a fringe reading, and it isn't recent. This tradition was compiled centuries before a single word of Christian doctrine about Sodom existed. The oldest reading of this story, the one written down first in the language of the people who wrote Genesis in the first place, is a story about a society that turned charity into a capital offense. Not a story about who someone chose to sleep with. A story about what a wealthy city was willing to do to anyone who dared to be poor or foreign or simply different in its streets. But I almost didn't get to the part that actually broke me. I want to tell you honestly, because I think the honest version matters more than the tidy one. Around week 6 of this, I genuinely almost put the whole research folder down. I had Ezekiel, I had the Talmud's bed and its courts. I understood intellectually that the earliest reading of this story was about institutionalized cruelty rather than the narrow lesson I'd taught for over a decade. And I remember thinking, fine, I have my correction. I have my new footnote for the lecture I'll never give again. This is a satisfying but ultimately dry academic update. It felt, at that point, like an interesting fact and nothing more. I nearly closed the laptop. Then I found the Book of Jasher. It's not scripture in the way Genesis or Ezekiel is scripture. It's a much later collection preserving older oral tradition, and I want to be precise about that distinction, because precision is the whole point of everything I'm telling you tonight. But what it preserves in its account of Sodom is a name, a person, not a citywide abstraction about institutionalized cruelty. One girl. The text says Sodom had passed a formal proclamation, No one was to give bread to any poor man on pain of death until he starved in the street. Against that decree, a young woman, named in this tradition as Paltith, one of Lot's own daughters, began secretly carrying bread to a starving stranger. Day after day, she hid it in her water jar so the guards at the gate would see only a woman fetching water, nothing more. When the men of the city finally discovered why the beggar at their gate refused to die, they found her out. They burned her alive. I need a second here, honestly, because I still don't have a clean way to say this next part. There's a parallel version of this same story. An anonymous sodomite girl. In a different retelling. Smeared in honey and left for the bees to kill slowly instead. Two versions. Same underlying horror. A city that didn't just tolerate cruelty as an abstract social failing, a city that executed a young woman by fire for the specific crime of feeding a hungry man. And here's the detail that actually reframes the entire story for me, the one I keep circling back to. Genesis itself says God investigated Sodom because the outcry against it had grown too great to ignore, a cry that reached heaven and triggered the whole catastrophe. For my entire life, I assumed that outcry was some vague, undefined complaint about vague, undefined wickedness. The oldest Jewish tradition says otherwise. It says the cry that mattered, the cry that finally got an answer, may have been the specific, literal, human sound of a young woman burning for the crime of compassion. The fire that fell on that city, in this reading, was an answer to a fire a girl was made to die in first. I don't know how to teach a Sunday school lesson about that. I don't think it was ever meant to become one. Before I go on to the last piece of this, the part with an actual excavation trench and a real scientific controversy, I want to mention something once, because a few of you have asked. All of this, the Ezekiel cross-reference, the Talmud, the Jasher material, comes from years of research I've compiled into a written library, every source cited properly so you can check my work, instead of just trusting a guy talking into a camera. It's linked in the pinned comment if you want to go deeper than any single video can hold. I won't keep bringing it up tonight. I just think, given where we're headed next, you deserve to know it's there. So here's the question I actually went looking to answer 3 months ago, before any of this Ezekiel and Talmud material had even crossed my desk. Is there anything real underneath any of it? Is Sodom pure legend, the way I'd always quietly assumed, something closer to Atlantis than to Jericho? Or is there an actual city in an actual place that an actual archaeologist has actually dug into the ground? There is. And this is the part that took me to that trench northeast of the Dead Sea. An archaeologist named Stephen Collins has spent years excavating a site called el-Hammam on a broad, well-watered plain northeast of the Dead Sea. His argument, laid out with Latane Scott in a book called Discovering the City of Sodom, is that this location matches the geography Genesis itself describes. A well-watered plain the text compares explicitly to the Garden of the Lord, visible from a height where Abraham and Lot stood together, deciding which direction each man would take his flocks. Collins isn't guessing at a vague region. He's matching a specific description in Genesis chapter 13 to a specific plain you can stand on today. This wasn't one archaeologist with a shovel and a theory. It was a multi-year excavation, season after season, involving specialists in ceramics, in soil chemistry, in radiocarbon dating, cross-checking each other's conclusions the way a real dig actually works, slowly, skeptically, one stratigraphic layer at a time, not a single dramatic afternoon with a metal detector. That's the part I think gets lost whenever this story gets compressed into a headline. Nobody found Sodom in a weekend. People spent careers on that plain before anyone was willing to say a full sentence about what the ash actually meant. And what his team found in the ground isn't a scattering of broken pottery you have to squint at and interpret generously. It's a citywide destruction layer, carbon and ash roughly 5 feet thick, in some places, melted mudbrick, pottery that shows signs of exposure to temperatures that don't occur in an ordinary house fire. And after that layer, nothing. No rebuilding. An occupation gap of roughly 600 to 700 years before anyone tried to live on that plain again. A thriving Bronze Age city, violently ended, and then simply abandoned for the better part of a millennium. I stood in that trench and asked the obvious question out loud. What actually did this? And that's where the story gets complicated in a way I have to be honest with you about. Because a channel like this one only works if I tell you the parts that don't resolve as neatly as I'd like. In 2021, a team of researchers, including Collins himself, published a paper in the journal Scientific Reports, part of the Nature family of journals, arguing that a cosmic airburst, something similar in scale to the 1908 Tunguska event in Siberia, was responsible for the destruction. Shocked quartz. Melted materials consistent with extreme heat. A specific dramatic mechanism for how an entire city could burn at temperatures a normal fire doesn't reach. Here's the honest part. That specific paper was retracted in 2025, following disputes over image handling and over whether the data actually supported an airburst as dramatic as Tunguska. I'm not going to pretend that didn't happen, and I'm not going to bury it in a footnote. It happened, it's public, and it matters. But, and this is the distinction I think gets flattened every time this story gets simplified into a headline, the retraction applies to the airburst mechanism paper. It does not retract the excavation. It does not retract the dated destruction layer. It does not undo the documented multi-century abandonment of that plain during the Middle Bronze Age. A city was still violently destroyed. People still stopped living there for hundreds of years afterward. What's actually still being argued about among serious researchers isn't whether something catastrophic happened on that plain. It's what specifically caused it. And there's a further honest complication I owe you because I think it's the most interesting part of the whole archaeological question, not the least interesting. Tall el-Hammam isn't the only serious candidate for Sodom. Further south, near the bottom of the Dead Sea, sites called Bab ed-Dra and Numera show their own Bronze Age destruction layers, their own burned cities, their own abandonment. Two separate locations, roughly 100 miles apart, both cities of fire, both cities that stopped existing around the same general era. Scholars genuinely disagree about which, if either, matches the specific plain Genesis describes. I used to think uncertainty like that meant the story was probably fake. I don't think that anymore. I think the uncertainty is the actual discovery. Not one tidy site with a plaque that says, Sodom confirmed. Two real Bronze Age cities of fire on the same ancient landscape the Bible sets this story in, and a live scholarly argument over which one, or whether both, belongs to the account Genesis preserved. That's a stranger, more honest answer than either, it's all a myth, or we found it, case closed. And strange and honest, it turns out, is so much more interesting than the version I would have preferred. Here's what I have to admit cost me something in all of this, because every real discovery costs something, and I don't think it's honest to pretend this one didn't. I can't hear the word Sodom anymore without seeing Paltith. I used to be able to use that word the way it was handed to me. One clean syllable standing in for one clean, narrow lesson, delivered and moved past in 40 minutes, quiz on Friday. I can't do that anymore. Now, every single time I hear that name invoked from a pulpit or dropped into a headline or used as an easy insult, I see a specific young woman hiding bread in a water jar, and I see the fire that was lit under her before any fire fell from the sky. That's not a comfortable trade. I would, if I'm honest, sometimes rather have the old simple version back. The one that let me close the chapter and move on. But you don't get to unknow a detail like that once it's in you. You don't get to unhear the specific human cost this word has always been carrying, quietly, underneath the shorthand everyone agreed to use instead. I taught that word for 12 years as if it meant one thing. I know now it was never that simple. It was never allowed to be that simple in front of a classroom because the version that got taught was the version that was easiest to teach, not the version the text itself actually preserves. Go back with me for a second to that stack of quizzes I graded years ago, the ones where every single student, across 4 class sections, gave me back the exact same one-word answer I'd handed them. I told you that story like it was a small, almost charming memory. I don't think it's charming anymore. What I was actually looking at in that stack of quizzes was proof of how completely a filtered story can replace the original without anyone ever noticing the filter was there. My students weren't wrong. I wasn't lying to them. I was faithfully transmitting exactly what had been transmitted to me. A version with Ezekiel's own gloss quietly excluded, with the Talmud's bed and its courts never mentioned, with Paltith's name nowhere in the curriculum I'd been handed. I thought, 3 months ago, that I was fact-checking a footnote about an archaeological site. It turns out I was checking whether an entire inherited memory had been trimmed down to fit. Not unlike, I keep noticing, that bed the rabbis describe. Stretched or cut, either way, until it matched what the room was comfortable holding. I don't have a tidy verdict for you tonight, and I want to be honest about why. I'm not telling you Sodom's sin was never anything about the things I was taught. I'm not telling you the archaeology proves the Bible line for line. What I'm telling you is that the real version, Ezekiel's own indictment of pride and neglect of the poor, the Talmud's portrait of a legal system built around cruelty, one girl's name buried in an apocryphal text, and 2 real burned cities on a real landscape that scholars are still honestly arguing over, is so much bigger, and so much more disturbing, and so much more human than the 4 verses and the one-word answer I used to hand a room full of 16-year-olds every October. I used to think finishing this story meant arriving at a clean answer. I don't think that anymore. I think finishing this story means being willing to hold Ezekiel and the mob at the door in the same hand without letting either one cancel the other out. I think it means telling you honestly that a paper got retracted instead of quietly hoping you wouldn't notice. I think it means saying, I don't know which burned city, if either, is the one Genesis meant, and meaning it instead of picking a side just to give you a satisfying ending. That's the version I actually believe now. I didn't arrive here to make the story simpler. I arrived here because the simple version was never the honest one. I keep thinking about the fact that I spent 12 years handing out the small version without ever once feeling like I was hiding anything. That's what actually unsettles me most, more than any single verse or any single excavation trench. It wasn't a conspiracy with a meeting and a memo. It was just easier, generation after generation, to teach 4 verses instead of a whole tradition. Easier to say one word instead of naming pride and cruelty and a girl burned for a loaf of bread. Nobody has to hide a story on purpose for most of it to quietly disappear. It just has to be more convenient to leave out. Everything you just heard tonight, the trench, the Talmud's bed, a name most people never learn, a retracted paper I told you about instead of hiding. None of that came from a press release. It came from weeks of cross-referencing primary sources that don't show up on the first page of a search engine, and reading academic material most people never get handed in a classroom, mine included, for 12 years. This channel doesn't get funded by an institution with an interest in this kind of digging staying buried. If tonight's investigation meant something to you, there's a super thanks button right below this video. It's not charity. It's closer to funding the next trench. And if you use it, you're not just watching this research happen anymore. You're one of the people keeping it alive. Before you go, tell me honestly, which piece of tonight actually stayed with you? Ezekiel's own verse, sitting there the whole time, unread from most pulpits? Or Paltith, a name most of us never learned, burned for a loaf of bread? I read every comment, and I'm genuinely curious which one you couldn't shake. And if you want the fuller version of tonight's research, every source laid out properly, the way I wish someone had handed it to me 12 years ago, it's linked in the pinned comment. No pressure, Just there, if you want it. I'll let you sit with that trench and that ash and that name. You decide what to do with it.